Morning. So today I want to talk about depicting complex experimental designs. And just to review a little bit, we have already depicted some level of complexity with a two-way design, which has a look like this. So for example, with a 3x3 design, we would draw a square with factor 1 being on one side, and factor 2 being on the other side, and levels A, B, and C of each. And this would be a 3x3 factorial. And the factorial nature of it is that we have every level of each factor with every level of every other factor. So this depicts that, and 3x3 means there will be actually 9 cells in our design, and we can count them up here and see that we have 9 cells. So this kind of diagram works for even more complex two-way designs. And remember that even though it's 3x3, this is a two-way factorial because it has 2 factors involved. And we can depict more complex ones just by drawing larger rectangles or squares that include the number of factors that we have. So for example, if we have 5 factors instead, or 5 levels of one factor and 2 levels of another factor, what is that? That's a 2x5 factorial, and we would expect 10 cells in that design, and we would then depict it like this. This is factor 2 on the top, and this is factor 1 over here. And typically, if we were going to publish a picture of our design like this, we would put in one of the cells the n that we had, for example, an n of 10. And we could even repeat that in all of these cells, or just put a ditto. Okay, so that is a way of depicting two-way designs, and we've already kind of covered that. So I want to move on to more complex designs. What if we have a three-way factorial? What does that look like? Well, that means we have, with a three-way factorial, we have 3 factors, and we have multiple levels within each factor. So let's take the simplest three-way factorial there is, which would be a 2x2x2 factorial. So here we have 3 factors with 2 levels of each factor. So how could we draw that so that we show all of the cells? Well, we could start with 2 of the factors. So here's factor 1, and we have levels A and B. And then we have factor 2, and we have also there levels A and B. But we also have a third factor, so how can we draw that so that it will show that we have all levels, all combinations? Well, we can make it into a cube, so we make it 3-dimensional. Okay. A little bit harder to draw, but not too bad if we allow ourselves some artistic license. And what we do then is we put the third factor on the axis that goes back into the screen. So maybe we have 2 levels of that factor. So this is a 2x2x2 factorial, and once again we could put our n in each cell of this design. Okay, and you can see then that this is going to have 8 cells in it, this particular design. And of course, if we want to increase dimensions in any way, we can certainly do that. Okay, so for example, we could have, well, let's make this a 2x3x4 factorial. Okay, so we're going to draw factor 1 here, having 2 divisions, A and B. We're going to have factor 2 have 3 divisions, 1, 2, 3, and factor 4, factor 3, factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, having 4 divisions. So we're going to draw this very carefully here. If you're like me, you're not very artistic, and this is a challenge to draw this many things in a way that looks like a nice cube. But with a little imagination we can do it, and we can actually do this kind of a diagram in PowerPoint and make it look pretty professional looking, and it will be publishable. And once again, we want to put our N in one of our cells, at least one of our cells. Okay, so for example, if you saw this, you would know to expect that there would be 24 cells in our design, and you would know that we would have 224 cells times 10 per cell. We would have 240 individuals that are being measured in this experiment. Okay, so you should be able to look at any one of these designs and in your head figure out the number of individuals that were used in that experiment. Okay, and I think it's a nice way of sort of conveying a lot of information in a small space. Okay, so that's a three-way factorial design. How about a four-way factorial design? If you think about that for a minute, it requires something that's very difficult for the human brain, and that is a fourth dimension. But we can get around that a little bit. So let's say we have, let me depict a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 factorial. So we can draw a 2 by 2 by 2 just like we did before. That's easy enough. But how can we draw another level here? So here's factor 1, factor 2, factor 3. How can we draw another level? Well, one way to do it is just to draw another cube. Okay, and we clearly have all levels of factor 1, 2, and 3 in factor 4, which is maybe has two levels, A and B. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3. And we then expect what? 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 16 cells in this design. If we count them up, we have 8 here and 8 here. Once again, we can put our N in one of these cells. I'd probably put, an N of 8. I'd put it in both pictures just to show that it was equal between levels A and B of factor 4. How about 5 factors? Well, it starts to get hard, I mean, you could potentially, have another dimension back here, which is factor 5, and you draw a cube here and a cube here. But at some point it does become quite challenging to illustrate 5 factors. So that kind of brings up the larger question of when should we be actually designing experiments that are this complex and this huge? Typically, you want to choose factors that you are actually interested in. And where this can get complicated is where you do have spatial variation or temporal variation. You want to account for that, and so you add blocks and things like that. So blocks and things like replicate trials, where you redo an entire experiment 3 times, for example. Those are not things you're interested in. You're interested in the factors you're varying within those blocks and within those replicate trials. But generally, you want to try to keep it simple. Keep it simple. Use the old KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And choose factors that you're interested in. And so when you start choosing like 3 factors, A, B, and C, and you're actually interested in those, it can be difficult to interpret the model. So we know if we just have 2 factors, our model is A, B, A cross B, right? In JUMP when we set it up. What about when we have 3 factors? What is our model? Our model is A, B, C, A cross B, A cross C, and B cross C, and A cross B cross C. So suddenly we get a rather complex model. We're dispersing our degrees of freedom among lots of factors, and so we have less power to test any factors unless we, of course, keep the replications increasing, and they increase quite fast. An experiment can get huge really fast when we have multiple factors. But remember also the Blibble principle. The bottom line is the bottom line. When we design a three-way experiment, in general, we should be interested in this one. Because if it's statistically significant, then the others become subject to more interpretation. Because if we say the A cross B term is dependent upon the C level, well then interpreting A cross B becomes challenging, and vice versa for all of these two ways, and even more so for the main effects. So once again, we interpret this hierarchically from the bottom up, and so hopefully we are interested in this third one, because if it's statistically significant, then the second ones become more problematic to interpret. Now, we can still interpret them, as I've talked about before. It's possible to interpret two-way interactions, just like it's possible to interpret main effects in a two-way design. It's possible to interpret these even when this is significant, but you have to do it in the context of the significant three-way interaction. All right, so we've used two principles here to kind of urge you to design the simplest experiment to answer the question you want to answer. Try not to make it overly complex, because then the analysis can be fraught with complications in terms of interpretations. Okay, I think that's the lesson for today. I've been talking about factorial experiments at this point, and I haven't talked about nesting factors, but that's going to come into this. Just keep in mind that so far with all of these depictions, we have every level of one factor with every level of another factor, whether we have 2, 3, or 4 factors involved in the design. That's not going to be true when we add nesting into the situation. But I think we're going to find that these ways of depicting experiments are especially helpful when we do get nesting, because you're going to start better understanding the relationship among factors, and that will help you set up more complex models in an organized kind of fashion. Otherwise, you can get hopelessly lost trying to figure out how to set up a model with a complex experimental design. Okay, that's it for today.